Hi, welcome to the post-mortem for the aspie ship project. It's more of a dev diary considering at least Lance and I are going to be presenting this at the Netherworld Squiggly River showcase at the end of this month. But I wanted to talk about all of my thoughts following the school expo and the end of the school part of this project, I guess. Uh, you could probably guess with the name, but the game is very inspired by mine and Lanz's experience regarding communicating with others. So you can see it started out a little differently um, in that we really wanted like a 3D puzzle game where it was very difficult to communicate between the players, and they had to decipher the controls whilst working out how to best communicate with each other. I think the pitch went really well. Lance and Tristan were actually away that day, unfortunately, but I presented a revised pitch to them at a later date, and they were both very keen to work on it. I'm pretty sure Lance was keen from the start because we talked about material design in the very first week. Not sure it was before class or if it was after, but we both had the same kind of idea to convolute the communication between two players to reflect what basically life's been like for us. And even in class, I think the pitch went really well with everyone else because I spelled out exactly what elements of other games were really inspiring for me, and there was actually no clarifying questions. Everyone had a solid idea of what it was, and there was a lot of interest in the idea, which I was pretty happy with. I think I was the only one that had an inspiration slide, which I think is really important, and I will continue doing stuff like this because I didn't even have speaker notes for my presentation. All I needed to do was really spell out exactly what it was in each one of the games that inspired me, which you can see here. And in Don't Crash It, it was the asymmetrical but simple controls, the way two people piloted one thing with shared information. By sharing information, sorry, they had separate information, which was either the vertical area where the hole was for the helicopter to go through, or the horizontal area where the hole was. You can see that on the screen there. And I was really inspired by Too Many Captains again, by the asymmetrical nature of the multiplayer elements and the mechanical thing that you do, like plugging in the wires. And together was just a really pure cooperative thing where information is abstracted from the two players. So they all have that they're cooperative, asymmetrical, and that there's disconnected information. So, I mean, in each one of these games, the players weren't looking at or listening to the visuals or audio that the other player was, so that really separated that. And the idea was that we have one player in a cockpit and another player in like the engine bay or whatever, trying to fix the ship or operate the ship. And I'm going to do more of these in the future. I only really needed to give this to Lance and Tristan, and they knew what my idea was, even if it wasn't as extreme as you see here. But you've got player one in the cockpit communicating what's going on, and player two has a whole bunch of stuff to do, but they don't know what it does without the feedback from player one. What we ended up with met the first brief. We had a choice of 3 briefs. The first brief being design and build a game based around a custom-built controller. The other 2 were, I think, let's have a look. Yeah, use a mass-produced device for something it's not designed for, and obviously in an interesting way, and no computer required, which is using fabricating electronics potentially um, for a custom controller that doesn't need a computer. I think I was always leaning towards doing a custom controller because um, I have the electronics fabrication skills, and I thought that would be a really cool way to like split up work, because you could have one person on the team doing the fabricating and inputting in the design process and the virtual game production, which is kind of what I did. I wrote all the documentation regarding design and made the control. So I spent all of my time concepting material designs and then prototyping them. I had quite a few prototypes. I think I had 3 at least. The first one being for that 3D puzzle that we thought was both boring and a little too convoluted and difficult to play. Uh, Although Lance and I are very inspired to communicate that feeling that we have when we're talking with others, we didn't think this was the best way to do it in the end. You can see here in this image Lance testing out inputs in Unity, and this was our first test of really plugging the Arduino into Unity. We'd just used the Arduino program before then, but you can see the 2 little loose white wires. We're hot wiring them to emulate a switch, and we move the capsule across the screen. And this is also when we figured out that buffering was going to be a problem. That is, Unity will take all of the inputs that Arduino sends it and just like make a big backlog that it's got to read through every single line on, and that can make this input hang thing where when you let go of the hot wire, it will keep moving that direction because there's still heaps and heaps of that input stacked up. So this is where Lance realized he was going to need to spend some time on threading so that we wouldn't have that input hang. And this led to a big rescope discussion where we shared a lot of ideas, and Lance showed that he's really capable in design with this game structure little table here. This was the design idea that Lance pitched for his downscope idea. It used the same audio jacks that I'd already bought and I'd already tested with a prototype with that subwoofer, but it would have required some really accurate fabrication. While we were talking about the pros and cons of this, I reminded Lance about how about how like rebellious and accomplished it felt to hotwire the Arduino in our first test. And although I'm sure a lot of that feeling of accomplishment came from the fact that we're doing this new thing, we're challenging ourselves by plugging Arduino into Unity, but I wondered if just that feeling of hotwired could be themed up to make a fun game. And so in that giant discussion on Rescope, I pitched the idea of making a hot wiring game where you you're stealing a ship, and so one player, it's like Bonnie and Clyde in space. I think I said a few times. One player's hotwiring the movement of the ship to escape the cops or whatever, and the other player is communicating what they see or doing something else that's peripheral to that hotwiring. When we pitched this to Adrian, he had some really good considerations to share regarding co-op design. He talked about the necessity of a give and take kind of system, like a conversation has give and take. The gameplay needs to as well. And I was really inspired by my many hours in Elite Dangerous distributing power across like weapons, shields, and thrusters. And I thought, well, a power resource that changed the effectiveness of different parts of the ship or different operations would be a good way to have a token that the players could pass back and forth. And if we go to my old documentation, you'll see that I had quite a few revisions. The first one, like always for me, was way too complicated. You can see that the token that the player on the right here is passing the player on the left is either boosting the laser or shield or neither, or both. Here we go. It's spelled out here in these little text boxes. Obviously way too complicated. Following conversation with the guys, we simplified a little bit to this. This is the point in the project where Lance and I were really starting to talk about like hypothetical play situations. So we would look at the design in the document, and then based off the many Google comments that I've resolved, we would talk about the pros and cons of the current thing and how we could tweak that, which is really good kind of creative collaboration there. When you're talking about solutions and the pros and cons of solutions and tweaks to other people's solutions as well as your own, and there's no ego in the conversation, that's when a team can make something good, can design well, because you by yourself, no matter how good you aren't going to design something real or like strong unless you keep it really simple. If you're by yourself and you don't have people challenging the solutions or that you're pitching. So objective conflict resolution is looking at the problem and the solutions and removing ego from the solutions or the problems and just concentrating on the pros and cons of each. And with this one, we didn't see much of a reason, I think, for the player on the left, the engineer, to give that turret boost. And the way that the turret boost was kind of connected to the fire button was, I thought it was good, visible affordance, but I think in the end it was a little too complicated, and the final design saw no real connection between these two except for the virtual power resource mechanics. You'll also notice that instead of a laser or turret boost, that the engineer is just toggling on the shield. We talked a lot about this because we're really into the passing tokens back and forth. By the way, we had like no game at this stage. This was all I was having such a good time just talking on voice chat with Lans and in class about these mechanics. Some people have said we were a bit, let's say, distracting because our conversations were a bit heated sometimes, but that's just our language. Like, we're very, very serious people, and it might seem like we're not having a good time to people outside, but at least I had such a great time debating the pros and cons of different solutions with Lands, and I'm really excited about designing something else from the ground up, potentially for final, because I think we can collaborate really well, and if we work on our language, it might even seem like a really positive experience to those outside of it. But anyway, Lenz pointed out that having the thrust and the shield on the engineer's side was making the engineer more of like a shepherd. Like, they would protect the ship and they would keep it out of danger, whilst the pilot was like the kid with too much energy. They just wanted to shoot everything. And if we scroll down to the asteroid table, so the idea that a medium asteroid, when shot, breaks into small ones that can also damage the ship, meant there would be that communication from the engineer about like the behavior of the pilot shooting everything in sight. It would be a point to converse. For example, if the pilot was shooting asteroids they didn't need to, that were well out of the way or never a risk, and tiny asteroids were then flying towards the ship and putting it in danger, the engineer, or I was thinking of it like the mum, would have a stern word with the pilot, which I'm thinking of as the kid. And I was really happy to see that kind of communication in the expo, which is our first real playtest, unfortunately, but I learned a whole lot from it. For example, we put a lot of effort into ensuring that hot wiring would be zero risk. So let's go have a look at that. This setup not only ensures that there's no noise going into any of the analog inputs down the bottom, it also makes sure that there's only a tiny amount of current going through that live power wire that connects to all the input wires. For those that haven't actually seen this in play yet, the loose wires look like that. So you've got the shield wire here in blue, and you've got the power wire here in black, and the thruster wires here. So I've got to do a bit of moving around to make sure that the power wire can't bridge the shield and the thrusters, because we want the player to do either or. They only want to have to do the shield if they have to. It needs to be a very, oh, did I have to put that shield on? Come on, pilot, what are you doing? This shortly after I took this picture, I accidentally cut the soldering iron cable. You see right in front of me there, it was jumbled up with some other. You can see on the right here, this is actually an old power cable that I was using to dress this up. And yeah, instead of cutting that, I accidentally cut this, so that was really sad. Thankfully my housemate had a spare soldering iron that I eventually found. And this terminal helped a lot in regards to keeping all the circuitry neat and clean. I have taken a lot of screenshots this trimester. Here we go. Sweet. Paint looks horrible here. I sanded this back again and gave it another spray, but it's not a big deal. So this is the glove box it's like a hinged top, and so you flip this open, so it feels like you're opening up the glove box and you're diving into the dashboard of the spaceship. Zach Croslow had an awesome idea to put like a schematics diagram here, just like you might see in some cars, little schematic of like user operations or something. But we could totally put a representation of the colored wires here and have little plaques that label what each wire does. So instead of looking up at the game to really see the effects, the engineer is really looking at the schematics and knowing for sure what each colored wire does. For example, I know white thrusts up and yellow thrusts right, but a little diagram just here on the underside of the hinged glove box thing would really help dress this up as a dashboard for one, but also really push that material design, that what that player is doing is physical, it's in the real world, and I'm hoping that'll highlight like how cool it is that you're like hot wiring wires. But yeah, like I said, people loved it at the School Expo. They dived into the hot wiring, which I thought was going to be I thought people were going to be put off by loose wires potentially being dangerous, and like I said, that small challenge in this design was easily solved with resistors and analog inputs. Lands just reduced the read amount to such a small current that even like something like 1.5 volts at a tiny amperage would be read by any one of those colored cables, but you wouldn't even feel it. I mean, you don't even feel 5 volts really. It's like a little tingle, but there's no way 1.2, 1.5, whatever it was, is going to be a risk to any pacemakers, new or old. Okay, on to project management. I wasn't the project manager. Lands was, and he had an excellent start. Started off really strong with an awesome roadmap that I used in my documentation for the commercial project. This is it here. We all petered off a bit, but also he was very consumed with the interfacing for Arduino and Unity. Land and I probably spent another 50% of the expected hours on this project. That was part of why we needed to rescope, downscope to the hot wire, because our commercial project had a lot more demand than the material design. The material design was supposed to be half the hours of commercial, I'm pretty sure. So I think this is good, this roadmap and delivery documentation, but in the future I'm certainly going to be using hack and plan. You know, you start with something like this simple, but then you make all the milestones that you see here for each week in hack and plan, and you just start to block out tasks in the backlog. Our task tracker was used at the start of the project. You can see I've slacked off a lot here in logging the hours near the end, and in the last week or two I was just putting like to-do lists in and asking Tristan to assign himself. But on that, I don't think it's a good idea to like just block out a whole bunch of to-dos and say, yep, do what you want to everyone, because they may just do a little bit of all the things that they've assigned all at once, instead of doing something, finishing it, logging it, which is why hack and plan and task dependencies are so important, because I was asking for one thing, but Tristan would do a little bit of a few things and not be able to send that one thing in on time. So these spreadsheets are great that Lance and I have worked on, and there's a lot of like game functions, or I can't get to it. So there's a lot of functions here I've done that like gamify, the process. So it's getting a count of the yeses and nos, and just the yeses, and marking a complete tally. And this is just a sum of all the hours. So we could keep track, but like this is cumbersome, and it was a lot of work to set up. And you filter something or you sort something, and everyone that uses the spreadsheet sees that. But in free stuff like Hack and Plan, you can filter per user. Like it's a local thing. It's not like every time I came to this spreadsheet, it would have looked like this, and like it's just a whole lot of clicks to get a whole overview again. I think this was a really good idea from Lance early on, keeping track of what I was spending on hardware, because like he and I very much like things need to be fair. Like if we both want to spend money on a custom controller, it needs to be half-half. But yeah, this was good because I would have spent a lot on materials at the end of the project, a lot of money I don't have, so it was good to have that total reminder of how much I've spent and how much I plan to spend, and that kind of kept me conservative because I'm completely broke. The asset list was taken from my commercial project, so this layout was what I used for all my collaborators, but which I'll talk about in the next video. I don't know if I gave Tristan a task to fill this out and like source all the models. I know Lance was trying to get him to do all the sourcing assets and keeping track of it, but I think, again, I'm going to push Hack and Plan. If there was task dependencies that spelled out exactly what to do, exactly where to put it with links and pictures, I think there's a much better chance that it's going to be engaged with. Tristan and Lance wanted to use spreadsheets, but in the future I'm going to take a really hard stance and use Hack and Plan regardless. Even if people want to do the spreadsheets thing and I'm not project manager, I will set up my own little Hack and Plan, and I will convert the roadmap into the things I imagine I'll do. So other people's behaviors are no excuse to change your behavior to something you think is inefficient or something that doesn't work with you. So yeah, this was basically a project plan, this roadmap, task tracker, and configuration, team details. And at least in the first few weeks, following the Hotwire, the Hotwire rescope, we did a good job following it. Lance and I were so efficient, we were like pumping through the tasks early on. So yeah, project management, project planning is so important for any kind of efficiency, and it's probably because we petered off in this regard that we lost a little bit of momentum in the middle there, but we picked it up again at the end when we were thinking about Expo. Lance did a lot of cool stuff, which we should look at now. Actually, I've been talking so much about bloody documentation, but this interface object is set to don't destroy on load, so it comes across the game scene and back, and it holds our Arduino information. So the Arduino app is in here somewhere. This is what I was looking for. So this lets us just test on the computer. But the other clever thing I want to talk about in regards to this interface that Lance has done here what's the Arduino controller, you can set the stuff obviously in the editor while you're testing, but for the build, like, you don't know what port it's going to be, and unless it's set a port, it won't you won't pick up Arduino input. And so Lands has done this clever thing where he loads a text document in the build at runtime that that accesses a port that's set in that text document. My microphone headset thing is beeping at me because it's low, but before I wrap up, I want to talk about sliders and how good they are. So if we go to the game, one of the things I added in the last week or two was just, I had some really convoluted ways to communicate the mechanics, the power share mechanics of shield and turret. In the end, I think I'd even consider scrapping the more complicated mechanics and use some kind of... I just dress it up a little better than this. But the regen of these... I'm just going to load from the menu, actually. So that's toggling the turret boost on, and you can see the shield slider dropping down when you toggle it on. If it's off, you can see the shield regens even higher, and you lose all of that if you toggle it on. So if the pilot doesn't see that, the engineer will surely communicate to them. And the slider also communicates cooldown really effectively. So you can see Lands has even changed the color of the slider if it's not ready, and if you try and press P to shoot a laser, it does nothing, it doesn't make any sounds, and just the lack of sound and that grayed out bar is plenty to communicate what's going on there. And I was actually surprised that Expo goers knew what was going on so quickly. So yeah, I'll dress them up, but sliders should go into your prototypes if you've got like any kind of interesting mechanics that are stacking on top of each other, and that's something I tend to do, and I manage to simplify considerably, and that is like stack mechanics in my game and make it more difficult to communicate the relationships between them. So yeah, sliders and hack and plan. That's the takeaway for my material design, I guess. But also, like in any game, instead of trying to finish a whole thing, like a whole dashboard or a whole little 3D puzzle, and then make game for it, you should make a little piece. So I could have just had one audio jack that you plug into a thing, or then another thing, and then we could have made a little snippet of game to test out how that felt, because we never really had a game that used that original prototype. We rescoped before we even had something virtual for that. So in the future, I'll be using hack and plan to like milestone, not just like generic things like prototype and then final delivery, blah blah blah, but more like our milestone snippets of the gameplay, using those user stories as a guide. And on that note, actually, it's something Lance and I did naturally, and that was talk about player experiences as if we are the player when we're going through the design documentation together. By the way, Google Comments, awesome, and like I would work with Lens in a heartbeat, just because we were so efficient with documentation, because we would use Google Comments extensively and address it all so that we could resolve it. And yeah, I really enjoyed that, and like I've been, my interest in design has been reinvigorated. Like I've always been big on the documentation, but I've kind of been slacking off in the last trimester or two. But I'm certainly excited about writing copious new documentation, because it's what makes like games real instead of just, you know, like this idea up in the air that will never exist. So I think of documentation as important as like skills in Unity, because if you don't know what you're doing, you're kind of just dicking around with no real goal. Anyway, that to user stories here. So this is a game dev planning blog by Laura Bolaraka, I think it's pronounced. I don't know, but check it out here at Gamasutra. And it's obviously talking about project planning, but I read this after like Lance and I had those awesome like player stories conversations, and this takes the usefulness of player stories further, in that your planning documents should, although it's a bit of work, they should be categorizing I guess tasks by a user story. So if we want the player to say, hey, don't shoot that laser at that thing you didn't need to because it damages us, we need only a few certain mechanics to tell that story and see if that's how it's going to happen. Because we can hypothesize like a user story, but like until you make it a really succinct little task or set of tasks in Hack and Plan, with that being the goal, like you kind of lose track of the pieces of the game that are important. So give this a read and think about how you can make your milestones in your planning software or project plans, spreadsheets. Think about how you can make them entail a snippet of gameplay or a user story. Alright, thank you. My next video will be all about my commercialization project, Fujin. Peace.